My name is John, and my life has always been quite predictable. Work, 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 home, family. But one day, my wife Elizabeth, her mother Margaret, and I decided to take a break and go on vacation to the charming Venice. We arrived in the city on water early in the morning and immediately plunged into its unique atmosphere. Narrow streets, ancient buildings, canals with gondolas, all this created a feeling of a fairy tale come to life. Having settled in a cozy hotel in the city center, we decided to take a little walk around the neighborhood and visit the local shops. Elizabeth and Margaret were delighted with the shop windows filled with bright Venetian masks, exquisite Murano glass items, and handmade lace. After the walk, we went to have a snack in a small cafe overlooking the canal. The cozy atmosphere, aromatic coffee, and fresh pastries, what could be better to start a vacation? However, an hour after our lunch, Elizabeth suddenly felt unwell. She was nauseous, dizzy, and could barely stand on her feet. It seemed her stomach couldn't handle the introduction to the local cuisine. "John, I told her not to overdo it with pasta and tiramisu." Margaret reproachfully shook her head, supporting her daughter by the arm. "She never knows when to stop." I just sighed, remembering how Elizabeth had been eagerly devouring one dish after another at lunch. Well, now it was time to pay for the gastronomic excesses. Margaret and I helped Elizabeth get to the room and put her to bed. Pale and miserable, she muttered barely audibly, "It's okay. I'll be as good as new by tomorrow. I don't want to miss our sightseeing tour." My mother-in-law and I exchanged glances but didn't argue. After all, a lot can change overnight. We could only hope that Elizabeth would indeed feel better by morning. Alas, our hopes were not fulfilled. In the morning, Elizabeth still felt terrible. Pale, with dark circles under her eyes, she looked like a real sufferer. "John, I'm sorry, it looks like I won't be going anywhere today," my wife said in a weak voice, falling back on the pillows. "You and Mom will have to go without me. Have fun, and I'll rest for now." I sat on the edge of the bed and stroked Elizabeth's hand. Poor thing, how untimely this ailment had struck her. So many plans, so many anticipations, and all for nothing. "Honey, maybe we should postpone the tour? We can sit with you in the room, watch TV?" I suggested without much hope, but Elizabeth shook her head resolutely. "No way. Enough that I'll spend the second day of vacation within 4 walls. You and Mom go, have a change of scene, and I'll be alone, rest. Just don't forget to take care of Mom, okay?" I gave Margaret a questioning look. She shrugged and nodded like nothing to be done. Her daughter was right. There was no point in everyone moping in the room because of her illness. "Okay, if you insist. Get well then, and we'll try not to have too much fun without you." I winked at my wife and kissed her on the forehead. Margaret and I left the hotel and headed for the nearest pier. The first point in our cultural program was a gondola ride along the Grand Canal. Well, an eventful and interesting day awaited us. Venice greeted us with sunny weather and a light breeze from the lagoon. The gondolier, a young, smiling guy in a traditional striped shirt, helped us settle into the elegant black boat. "Welcome aboard. My name is Luca, and today I will be your guide through the labyrinths of the Venetian canals," he announced cheerfully. Margaret and I made ourselves comfortable on the soft seats, and the gondola started moving. Narrow streets, bridges spanning the canals, ancient palazzos, all this floated before our eyes, like frames from a movie. "Oh my God, how beautiful!" Margaret exclaimed now and then, clicking the shutter of her camera. "Elizabeth is missing out on so much by not seeing all this splendor." I nodded in agreement, admiring the unfolding views. Yes, our poor girl was really out of luck, but we will definitely arrange a personal tour for her when she feels better. After the gondola ride, we went to see the sights. St. Mark's Square with its grand cathedral, the luxurious Doge's Palace, the famous Rialto Bridge. All this simply took our breath away. Margaret and I wandered around the city as if enchanted. We peeked into ancient churches, admired works of art in museums, tasted local delicacies in cozy cafes. And all this time we chatted casually, sharing impressions and funny stories. I suddenly caught myself thinking that I had never communicated with my mother-in-law like this before, easily and in a friendly way. Usually everything was limited to formal conversations at family gatherings, and here we suddenly opened up to each other in a new way. "You know, Margaret, I'm glad we went on this walk together," I said as we sat down to rest on a bench in a shady square. It's so pleasant and interesting to talk with you." My mother-in-law smiled shyly and patted my hand. "I'm very glad too, John. Thank you for keeping me company. This day wouldn't have been so wonderful without you." In the evening, we returned to the hotel, tired but satisfied. Elizabeth looked better already, although she was still weak. She was happy to hear our stories and see the souvenirs, but quickly began to nod off. "Okay, youngsters, I'm going to bed," my wife yawned. "You go have dinner somewhere. And for me, rest is the best medicine right now." We wished her good night and headed to a restaurant we had noticed earlier in the day. A pleasant evening and an unforeseen turn of events awaited us. The restaurant turned out to be a charming place with a cozy interior and live music. Subdued lighting, soft jazz, wicker tables on an open veranda. All this created a surprisingly romantic atmosphere. Margaret and I ordered pasta and a bottle of red wine. The waiter, a quick-witted young man with a charming smile, immediately brought us appetizers. Bruschetta with tomatoes and cured ham. How delicious," Margaret commented, putting a piece of bread in her mouth. "We'll have to bring Elizabeth here when she feels better." I nodded in agreement and raised my glass. "Let's drink to our wonderful day and to Lizzie's speedy recovery from her ailment." Margaret clinked glasses with me, and we each took a sip of the ruby wine. It turned out to be excellent. A rich aroma, a velvety taste, a slight tartness. During dinner, we continued our leisurely conversation. But if during the day the conversations mainly revolved around the sights and impressions, now they became more personal, more frank. Margaret talked about her youth, about unfulfilled dreams and hopes. I shared my doubts and worries related to work and family. "John, have you ever regretted your choice?" Margaret suddenly asked, looking into my eyes. "Maybe you wanted something else from life? Adventures, vivid emotions?" Her question caught me a little off guard. I thought for a moment, then slowly said, "To be honest, sometimes it comes over me. I think here I am living in a well-trodden rut, homework home, and I want something unusual, exciting, to shake things up, to experience new feelings. Silly probably, huh?" Margaret silently shook her head. A strange expression flashed in her eyes, either sadness or understanding. "Not silly at all, John. I understand you perfectly. I have such thoughts too," she said quietly, and covered my hand with hers. That touch was like a lightning bolt through me. My heart started racing, my throat went dry. I suddenly distinctly felt the tension hanging between us, sparkling, hot, scorching. We finished the wine and paid, barely looking at each other. Awkwardness and embarrassment washed over us both, spilling out along with the unbidden frankness. We silently walked back to the hotel. In the lobby, I gallantly kissed Margaret's hand goodbye, and suddenly I felt her fingers tremble in my palm. "John, maybe we could take a little walk before bed?" she suddenly asked, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "Venice is so lovely at night." And I, not knowing why, agreed, although my mind suggested, "Run, you fool, run without looking back before it's too late." But how could I resist her pull? The devilish magic of this evening driving me crazy and pushing me to do crazy things. We slowly wandered through the night streets, illuminated by the soft light of lanterns. The silence was broken only by the echo of our footsteps and the splash of water in the canals. It seemed the whole city had frozen, immersed in a sweet slumber. Margaret took my arm, pressing her warm side against me. Her closeness sent shivers down my spine, my breathing quickened. I could smell her perfume, subtle, enchanting, with notes of jasmine. "How beautiful it is here," she whispered in admiration. "A magical fairy tale come to life." "Yeah, it's no wonder Venice is called the City of Lovers," I mumbled, trying to distract myself from the turmoil of feelings. Margaret suddenly stopped and turned to me. Her face was so close that I could see every eyelash, every wrinkle at the corners of her eyes. "John, I want to tell you," she began in a faltering whisper, but I didn't let her finish. Obeying an unknown impulse, I pulled Margaret to me and plunged into her lips with a greedy, passionate kiss. She gasped, but immediately wrapped her arms around my neck, responding with no less fervor. It was madness, sheer madness, kissing my mother-in-law in the middle of the night in Venice, risking being seen by random passers-by. Everything inside screamed, "No, no, you can't!" But the sweetness of her lips, the heat of her pressed body, overshadowed the arguments of reason. "Let's go. Let's go to my place," Margaret whispered, tearing herself away from my lips. Her eyes had darkened, Her breathing had become rapid and uneven. I silently nodded, unable to utter a word. We almost ran to the hotel, not letting go of each other's hands. Passion and lust drove us forward, making us forget about everything in the world. As soon as the door of Margaret's room closed behind us, the last barriers collapsed. We pounced on each other with feverish frenzy, tearing off clothes, caressing and kissing every inch of exposed skin. I remember what followed in snippets, in flashes. The hot intertwining of bodies on rumpled sheets. Hoarse moans and sobs, muffled by passionate kisses. The convulsive shudder at the moment of ecstasy bordering on insanity. It was akin to a blackout of the mind. All taboos, all attitudes flew to hell, swept away by a primal, irresistible attraction. We reveled in each other as if possessed, forgetting about propriety, duty, and family ties. Only an hour later, completely exhausted and emptied, we were finally able to tear ourselves away from each other. We collapsed on the disheveled bed, breathing heavily and not daring to look each other in the eyes. I came to my senses first. I sat up abruptly and clutched my head, trying to figure out what the hell we had done. Shame and horror washed over me like an icy wave from head to toe. God, we shouldn't have. What do we do now? I stammered, frantically looking for my clothes with my eyes. Margaret also sat up, pulling the sheet up to her chin. A mask of confusion and guilt froze on her face. John, I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. This is a mistake. A terrible mistake, she whispered, averting her eyes. We succumbed to a momentary passion, lost control. This should never happen again. I just nodded dejectedly. My mother-in-law's words echoed in my head, intensifying the emotions tormenting my soul. Shame, remorse, disgust with myself, and at the same time, an aching pain in my heart at the thought that what happened between us would never happen again. Yes, you're right. We're both good, damn it. Only thinking about ourselves. I smiled bitterly, hurriedly getting dressed. I hope Elizabeth never finds out. It will break her heart. And Tom's, too. Margaret flinched as if slapped. I almost physically felt a wave of remorse wash over her at the mere mention of her husband's name. John, I beg you, no one should ever know. Not Elizabeth, not Tom. Let's pretend nothing happened, she whispered feverishly, clutching my hand. I gently freed myself from her grip, looked into her eyes full of pleading and despair, and realized Margaret was right. The truth would only bring pain and destroy families, and that couldn't be allowed to happen. You're right. Let's forget about everything, okay? Chalk it up to the magic of Venice, to the madness of the moment. I took a deep breath, pulling myself together. For everyone, we're still the proper son-in-law and mother-in-law. Period. Margaret nodded convulsively and hid her face in her hands, holding back sobs. God, how I wanted to hug her, to comfort her, to say that everything will be all right, that together we will cope. But I had no right to do that, not after what I had done. I'll go. Good night, Margaret, I mumbled, heading for the door. And until morning, I'll try to convince myself that nothing happened. My mother-in-law sobbed something inarticulate in response. I turned around on the threshold to give her one last look. Slumped shoulders, disheveled hair, a hunched figure on the crumpled bed. I wanted to howl from the realization of the irreparability of what had happened. From the understanding that what had begun as a magical fairy tale had turned into a dirty, shameful fall. And now we had to live with it, to come to terms with it, to forgive ourselves, to learn to pretend, and to pray to God that my and Margaret's secret would never come to light. The last days of the vacation passed as if in a fog. Margaret and I tried not to be alone together, avoided meeting each other's eyes. We behaved in a friendly and relaxed manner in Elizabeth's presence, but as soon as she turned away, a tense, viscous silence hung between us. My wife, thank God, chalked up our absent-mindedness and thoughtfulness to fatigue from walking. She didn't suspect anything, continuing to admire the beauty of Venice and make plans for the future. And I had only one thought in my head: to get home as soon as possible. Away from the city, from temptations, from that fateful night. The walls of our cozy suburban home now seemed like a stronghold of stability, a protection from madness. And so we returned. Elizabeth immersed herself in work and household chores, I in my routine duties as a sales manager. Margaret and I hardly saw each other, except at general family gatherings where we were pointedly polite and aloof. No more heart-to-heart conversations, no more sparks or hints. Only perfunctory smiles and neutral phrases, behind which each hid their pain and regrets. It was as if we had crossed each other out of our lives, locked away the memories. At first it was not easy. Sometimes longing would wash over me, twisting my gut, especially at night when I lay awake next to my snoring wife. I was so tempted to pick up the phone, call and say, "I miss you. I miss you madly, desperately, Margaret." But I held on. I reminded myself, "You have obligations, John. You have a family, a reputation, a familiar way of life. You can't destroy everything because of one night of insanity." Gradually, the sharpness of the experience dulled. The pain didn't go away, it just became duller, more familiar. It drowned in the daily hustle and bustle, in the succession of worries and chores. I was learning to love Elizabeth again. I gave gifts, arranged surprises, paid compliments. I convinced both her and myself that everything was the same between us, that our marriage had not cracked, and almost believed it. Almost. Because sometimes I would catch Margaret's long, wistful gaze. I would notice how her fingers trembled when she passed the salt shaker at the dinner table. And I understood. She hadn't forgotten either. She also carried our shameful, painful secret within her. Then my heart would clench, a lump would rise in my throat. I wanted to jump up, walk right up to her and whisper, I'm sorry, and forget it. I have to keep my family together, stay true to my vows. We both have to." And I was silent. And she was silent. And no one around even suspected what a storm was hiding behind our ostentatious friendliness. What regrets and unfulfilled dreams were hidden in the corners of our eyes, in our stingy, forced smiles. Only we knew. The keepers of a big, dangerous secret. Two people who were briefly swept up in a whirlwind of forbidden passion, and now forced to deal with the consequences of our fall from grace. Lovers for one night, hostages of circumstances and a sense of duty. Victims of one magical city that opened Pandora's box. I often think back to that night, that sweet, bitter night full of remorse. I replay every detail in my head, savor the sensations, and at the same time I'm horrified by my own thoughts. But I can't help myself. That night with Margaret, our Venetian madness, it's etched in my memory, in my subconscious. It became a part of me, my hidden essence, a part that only the two of us know about. And we will remain silent until the end of our days, because everyone should have their own secret, right? Their own personal demon, locked away in a far corner of their mind. And sometimes it seems to me that it's the demons that make us real. They tear the usual masks to shreds, exposing the vulnerable, trembling core. To remain faithful, to love my wife, to never give in to weakness again. That's my cross, my eternal rule. Even if sometimes I want to scream, to shatter it to pieces, to tell the whole world to go to hell, to rush into the night, into the unknown, to embrace the one who gave me madness and ecstasy, to drown in her eyes, to lose myself in her passionate embrace. No, enough. Don't you dare, John. You have a duty. You have principles. And Venice? Well, let it remain a ghostly, searing memory, the city where you could do anything, where the whole world was at your feet, a mirage, a sweet dream, the one that appears only once and never, never will be repeated in reality. Did you like this story? Let us know in the comments what you liked. Subscribe to our storytelling podcast. Also, don't forget to like and ring the bell so you don't miss more interesting stories. See you soon.